Okay, peace. This is the shalom. This is the next video. I did a little bit of an introduction to what this series of videos are going to be about, and this is the next one. I want to basically discuss how I arrived at the certain things that I've arrived at. Okay, so when I was around about 16 years old, I went to Iran. It's my mother is from Iran, and I was speaking to my cousin, and I was in a state of confusion, some confusion. What I was confused about is that I I had realized that the religion that is practiced today, Islam, which is now sects, two different sects, big ones, and then there are some smaller sects, and the big ones are Sunni and Shia. One of them is more political division, but there are differences, quite big differences between them. But those sects arose after Muhammad's time, after Prophet Muhammad's time. So Muhammad, he died, and then they arose, these different sects. And they arose because the Sunnis, they followed the so-called Sunnah of Muhammad. They believed or became followers of his Sahaba, his companions, or they say his Sahaba, his companions. And the Shia, they are the following his family and the so-called imams. So my difficulty was, well, what was Muhammad's religion? He was not Shia, he was not Sunni, he was neither. He had God's book, the Quran, and he didn't have anything else. And if we look at Hadith and so-called Sunnah, firstly there are difficulties with this. The biggest difficulty is that they are many hundreds of years later they are collected. So one of the most famous Sunni collectors, Hadith collectors, called Bukhari, he collected his Hadith 200 years, at least 200 years after Muhammad. Now 200 years of basically supposedly sayings going from one generation to another. Initially, he says he collected around about 700,000 hadith, and then he kept around 7,000. So 99%, 98 to 99% of the hadith that he collected, he binned. This garbage and binned it. So what does that tell you? What does that tell you about his methodology? It tells us very clearly that he was the one who was selecting the hadith the so-called hadith, which applied to him, which meant something to him, or he thought was from Muhammad. Having not known Muhammad, very much like Paul, having not known Jesus, claiming on his behalf to have some information, he pieced together this mishmash of sayings attributed to Muhammad, so-called sayings attributed to Muhammad, and then said, no, this is part of the religion, as if God could not complete his religion with the Quran. Now, this alone, this is enough, without anything else, this is enough to make us suspicious about the authenticity of the hadith. So that's one issue. I mean, I was a Sunni, basically a Sunni Muslim, but I was from a Shia family. So I was taught by a Sunni, and I was taught how to read Arabic. I was taught the Quran. It was There was no confusion in my mind until I was started to be taught Hadith. And now, after when I was 16 years old, these thoughts entered my mind. Now, I reasoned with myself and thought, well, maybe there's things I don't know. So I prayed to God, and I asked questions. I asked questions of my family. What it was Muhammad's religion? If this is Sunnis or Shias, afterwards, what was Muhammad's religion? Now, I was blessed at that time that I was looking up um, some Sunni things, and specifically, I think it was the Mahdi at the end of the world and things like that. And I came across a website called submission.org. Maybe you have heard of it. You can go and look it up. Now, that had information on there, and it introduced me to the concept of Quran alone, which now I look at the Quran in a completely different way, a new way. And that is the way that God says in the Quran that if He willed, that um, if God's words will never run out. Now this is indications of two things. Firstly, that God has omniscience; He knows everything. And second thing is an indication that the Quran is all we need to know. And as the Quran says itself, that it is fusila, detailed, and that it is sufficient for us. It is detailed enough for us. And God says in the Quran that after God and His signs, His ayah, His signs, which hadith? It uses the word hadith very negatively. The Quran always uses it negatively when it's applied to other than the Quran, and positively when it's applied to the Quran. So which hadith other than this will you believe? Now, this is prophetic language, and in many translations they simply do not translate. They leave a lot of words untranslated, and they put a transliteration of the Arabic word in. But then they, once they've put this transliteration in, they leave it at that. But with the word hadith, they do not do that. They deliberately translate it. They translate it as narration or sayings or discourse, but they never leave it as it really is, which is it means hadith. It means hadith. Now, there is a deliberateness trying to confuse people and trying to get people to believe then in all of this other material. That the Quran, according to them, is not enough. It's not enough. In actual fact, according to most Muslims, God is not enough. Because the Quran says in Surah 3 verse 18, the true shahada, the testimony, the shahada means in Arabic is witness, witnessing, testifying. It's the root word, shahada. They misunderstand, they take that testimony and they add to it. The testimony, as far as God is concerned, is that there is no God except God. Now, Allah, anyone who is English speaking and doesn't understand much Arabic, literally is al, meaning the, and la comes from Elohe, which means God. So Allah means the God or God. And this is not hidden. Many Christians use the word Allah to refer to God, and Coptic Christians or Egyptian Christians or whatever. And Jews also use the word Allah to refer to God. So it refers to Allah, the God. So it's not that Allah is a special word or a special name of God. No. Allah simply means the God, or God. So La ilaha, no God, illallah, except God. This is the Shahada, according to who? God, His angels, and those who know. So anybody else who says a different testimony, a different Shahada, they're ignorant people, because it says those who know. So you have to add to that. The Christians, they can't have only God. They have to have Jesus. The Muslims, unfortunately, have fallen into the same trap, but on a different level. And they can't have only God. They have to have Muhammad next to it. And the Shia, they have to have Ali with them, and so forth, and so on and so forth. Therefore, we've got to this point in time where we have ignorant people representing Islam. And I would argue that these people, they're not ignorant because they've thought about it. A lot of them are not ignorant. They haven't thought about it enough. Or they've been told that the Quran is too complicated for them to understand. But they can't understand it unless they're an Arab literature genius, or if they're somebody who is a scholar. They have to go to university to understand it. But the Quran is not like that. The Quran is not like an ordinary book. The Quran is for ordinary people. Otherwise, we'd all have to go to university to study the Quran. And they only understand the Quran, they only say you can understand the Quran through Hadith. They say that you have to know Hadith to understand the Quran. But the Quran doesn't say that. The Quran says that God is the teacher of the Quran. That Muhammad was to only deliver it as a messenger of God, only to deliver the Quran. And this is I can bring the verses, and I will go into this in a bit more detail in other videos. But they bring all sorts of things. They say all sorts of things. For instance, they say obey God and obey the messenger. Now, obey the messenger is not obey Muhammad. It doesn't say obey Muhammad. It doesn't say, in fact, the Quran never mentions Sunnah Muhammad, the Sunnah of Muhammad. It always Sunnah Allah, God's Sunnah, God's law. Therefore, they've chosen words which are condemned by the Quran, or negative connotation by the Quran. It's very interesting. It's very, very fascinating. And so we need to move away from this. And I think my time's going to run out in a second, sorry. But we need to move away from this. So reading about Quran and Islam is removing the baggage, removing the rubbish out of Islam, and going back to what everybody agrees, that we have the Quran. Otherwise you have different Sunnah and Hadith from Shia and Sunni and all other sects, which we shouldn't divide ourselves into sects, that's another issue. But removing that, going back to what is actually important, which is the Quran. So inshallah we'll discuss more about that. You can see where I moved from, I had an inclination to understand it a certain way, and I moved away from that. I've moved away from Hadith and Sunnah to Quran alone. Okay, salam.